Welcome to Feminist Question Time, brought to you by Women's Declaration International, which is the leading global organisation defending women's sex-based rights against the threats posed by gender identity ideology. Many of us have been active feminists since the 1970s or even the 1960s. We were not surprised when this new attack on women came along, and we've not changed our analysis. Janice Raymond wrote The Transsexual Empire in 1979, and her analysis is essentially the same as ours. And then Mary Daly's insights in gynecology also link up very closely to our analysis now. So really many decades of understanding from radical feminists, understanding the threats men pretending to be women pose to us. In 2018, we wrote a declaration on women's sex-based rights, which lays out our position currently. And it's been signed by 39,395 people from 160 countries, and it's supported by 547 organizations. So very, very wide support globally. To promote this declaration and sex-based rights for women, we run these webinars. We have webinars, Radical Feminist Perspectives, on Sundays. And we also have activists, including country contacts from every continent in many countries in the world. So do join us. We do lots of networking and discussion outside these webinars, and we have breakout rooms where you can meet lots of different people. There are lots of different ways that we're working internationally. So you can become a member, you can volunteer, donate, and or get in touch. So I'm really pleased that this week we have 3 speakers. We have Anna Kerr from Australia, and the title of her talk is "Did Freemasonry Have a Role in the Roots of the Trans Movement?" We are then, after Anna, we will hear from Lauren Levey from the USA, and the title of her talk is "Choose Lesbian." And the third speaker is Miriam Kivlehan from Ireland, and she's going to give an update on what's happening in Ireland. Our first speaker is Anna Kerr from Australia. Anna Kerr is the Australian country contact for WDI and a founder and principal solicitor of Feminist Legal Clinic, Inc., which is a community legal service based in Sydney, which works to advance the human rights of women and girls with a focus on domestic violence and discrimination laws. And the title of Anna's talk today is "Did Freemasonry Have a Role in the Roots of the Trans Movement?" So thank you so much for speaking today, Anna, and over to you.
I'm just going to be doing a very superficial treatment of this topic, which is much larger than I at first realised. I don't have any direct personal experience with Freemasonry or any other secret society, so this is really just the results of my research over the last number of weeks. And but I hope to inspire some more research by others, because I think this is a topic that requires more feminist analysis. This is a quick warning to say that if you are someone with a weak stomach or who is easily offended, that this is probably time to tune out, because there is some graphic content in this presentation. Also, there may well be some inaccuracies, and I apologise for those. There is a huge volume of material on this, on the topic of Freemasonry, and a lot of it is conflicting, and so, you know, I apologise for any inaccuracies or offence that causes. I'm just going to start by saying the official thing, that Freemasons claim that the roots of their craft are in the medieval guilds of stonemasons in the 1700s, who used secret handshakes and symbols to identify each other and their level of training and expertise. And the aprons and the square and the compass were the tools of these stonemasons. So that's the basic thing. Freemasonry is organised into lodges, and you've probably seen some of these Masonic halls where you live. I think they're everywhere. The lodges are then governed by larger bodies called Grand Lodges. And in this photograph, if you can see it, some of the Freemasons there are celebrating an anniversary of the United Grand Lodge in England. And you can see there, for instance, the Queen's first cousin, Prince Edward, the Duke of Kent, in his ceremonial regalia, his masonry regalia. I've been amazed to discover just how many very famous men in history have been Freemasons. It's truly extraordinary, and that's just taking account of the names that are publicly acknowledged. Certainly in the Western world, it seems that if a man was famous, there's every chance he was a Freemason. I hadn't looked into that before, so a lot of the names were a surprise to me. If all the people claim to be Freemasons, by the Freemasons themselves, I'm just referring to their own information, if they all really were Freemasons, then I don't think you really need to be a conspiracy theorist to believe that the world is rigged in their favour. If you Google, top 5 artists, top 5 scientists, top 5 musicians, etc., you'll find that a lot of these individuals are apparently Freemasons, or were apparently Freemasons. But aside from the seemingly well-grounded claims of nepotism and corruption associated with Freemasonry, there's other more serious and colourful allegations that have been levelled against them throughout history. The public persona, though, that most people are aware of that Freemasonry presents to the world is that of a group of old men holding rather dull meetings with fancy aprons, secret handshakes, and bizarre and creepy rituals. Masons themselves claim to be focused on self-improvement and philanthropic work, and indeed they do continue to do a lot of operate a lot of charities. And I had a look at that, and there's certainly plenty of charities still operating that are operated by the Freemasons. So they've got plenty of dosh. But if that's all they do, why is it still so secretive? So there are lots of groups. So this list is just a few of the numerous offshoots and affiliated organisations associated with Freemasonry. There are many sort of copycat groups as well as appendage organisations set up with the purpose of providing a place from where they can recruit further Freemasons. So while Freemasons are perhaps the largest, oldest and best known group, they are only one of a menagerie of weird and wonderful clubs and societies that cater to secret men's business. And I say men's business because although it's true that there are forms of Freemasonry and affiliate groups that cater for women and girls, as you can see from this list, in Anglo-American Freemasonry, as opposed to continental Freemasonry, women are still largely excluded. Even when they do have their own groups, they apparently are often only permitted to meet when there are males present. So some of you may have direct experience with this and correct me, but this is just what my reading tells me. So sure, different types of Freemasonry, the rules are different, but it seems to be females aren't generally permitted to attend all the equivalent male functions. Fundamentally, these are fraternal societies. That's what they historically were set up as, to provide supportive brotherhood for men. And by their nature, they require men to keep secrets from the women in their lives as much as anyone else. So Freemasonry is often said to have been popular with returned soldiers, and perhaps that's because these groups provided confidentiality and unconditional brotherly love for men who are processing the trauma of wartime and the guilt associated with their complicity in violence. So Masonic groups are no longer limited to Protestant Christians, but can be found all across all cultures, religions, and political affiliations. Freemasonry does not claim to be a religion itself, but it certainly draws on symbolism and mythology from not only the Bible, but there's also elements from Islam, Judaism, and Eastern religions. Further, it would seem that there's a number of religions, such as Mormonism, that have been established by individuals who were originally Freemasons and which contain Masonic rituals. So, however, while Freemasons themselves claim to welcome members from all religious traditions, the favour is not necessarily returned. So, for example, there is without doubt hostility towards Freemasonry from the Catholic Church, which has several times banned its members from joining as Freemasons and has set up its own rival secret societies, such as Opus Dei. So at Jimmy Savile's funeral, for example, the men in regalia there were apparently not Freemasons. They were Catholic Knights of St. Columbus, who seemed to wear very similar regalia as the Freemasons and also like to turn up for funerals. So we can only speculate whether Savile's particular tastes were nourished within this secret society, and we'll probably never know because it's a secret. It seems clear that together with mainstream religions, Masonic societies have played a significant role in creating and maintaining patriarchal interests, not only by ensuring unequal treatment of women, but also through the accumulation of power through secrecy, deception, and violent threats, at least threats, if not more. So their symbol of the square and compass has a G in it, and the G is said to stand for God or geometry, or perhaps grand architect of the universe. Others say that it represents the word gnosis, which refers to secret spiritual knowledge. The Gnosticism also has the potential to apparently save your soul, but also upset the mainstream Catholic Church as a bit of a bonus there. So Gnostics challenge authority and the existence of an objective reality. To that extent, they sound a bit like postmodernism. The Catholic Church seems to hate the Gnostics because they keep on harping on about some discarded Gospels written by Mary Magdalene and others, which suggest that God was female, or at least androgynous. So these are the books of the Bible which the Catholic Church chose to discard, and then someone seems to have dug up some more copies somewhere in Egypt in 1945, which is terribly awkward. So it's no wonder they want to keep all this information secret from women, and I think really the Catholics and the Masons seem to be together on the need for secrecy from women for whatever reason. So certainly Freemasonry and Gnosticism share many symbols. They themselves agree on that. Many Gnostics have initiation rites and other rituals where they seek to achieve altered states of being and release the divine spark, which they believe is trapped in their material body. Some sects believe liberation comes through radical freedom, including breaking social and moral norms. And so we can only hope that this doesn't involve raping and eating babies, as has been alleged historically by the Catholic Church, as well as more modern conspiracy theorists. So just because these Gnostic and Masonic cults exclude women and keep secrets, that doesn't really necessarily make them terribly much different from the Catholic Church itself. And we all know how pure and safe that organisation is. Okay, so Masonic initiation rites have historically been referred to as riding the goat. No one seems to be quite sure why that is, although the Freemasons themselves deny the involvement of livestock. I have no idea, but this figure here, Baphomet, or the sabbatic goat, seems to be a winged hermaphrodite, which is often depicted with a pair of breasts. And this symbol is apparently associated with the Knights Templar. And although it cannot be formally established that Freemasonry arose out of the traditions of the Knights Templar during the Crusades, there's a great deal of romantic Masonic folklore and mythology that does claim that that is their origin. The Knights Templar were, of course, ultimately accused of heresy, blasphemy, idolatry, homosexual practices, and financial corruption by King Philip IV of France, who was apparently greedy for their money, and as well as the Pope. And in 1307, their leaders were arrested and burnt at the stake in a very Christian manner. So in view of this history, perhaps it is understandable that the Freemasons like to keep a low profile. And I notice in some of the material I've been reading through that in Africa, some people have coined a term anistocracy to refer to members of society who participate in Freemasonry and practice who are believed to practice what they regard as transgressive forms of sexuality in order to enrich themselves. So it does occur to me that maybe Freemasonry just provided a cover for men so they'd be able to engage in what was otherwise illicit homosexual sex at times and places when they've been otherwise persecuted for that. I don't know, this is speculation on my part. It's difficult to be sure about any of this because even the majority of members of Freemasonry aren't let into the top-level secrets, it seems the explanations provided to the apprentices at the lower levels are not necessarily the full story. And it seems the rank and file Freemasons might be both physically and metaphorically hoodwinked. And this is a picture of a traditional hoodwink or blindfold that's used in Masonic initiation ceremonies. According to Manly P. Hall in his lectures on philosophy, Freemasonry is a fraternity within a fraternity, an outer organisation concealing an inner brotherhood of the elect. The visible society is a splendid camaraderie of free and accepted men enjoying to devote themselves to ethical, educational, fraternal, patriotic and humanitarian concerns. The invisible society is a secret and most august fraternity whose members are dedicated to the service of a mysterious arcanum arcanorum, or secret of secrets. So Manly Hall says the truly secret inner society is to the large Masonic group what the heart is to the human body. But in each generation, only a few are accepted into the inner sanctuary of the work. So what is clear is that whatever they're hiding, they certainly don't want women to know about it. Because if you look at their Masonic initiation rituals, they require the exposing of the candidate's breast, apparently to ensure that they are not female. Interestingly, however, they are willing to retain men as members of male lodges, even when they have subsequently identified or transitioned to women, which suggests that Freemasons still know it's not really possible to change sex. The intention to exclude women is also evident in their traditional blood-curdling oath of the Master Mason, which, among other things, includes vows not to aid nor be present at the initiation of a woman. Obviously, they also promise other things, including keeping each other's secrets, promising not to cheat or defraud each other, not to have illegal carnal intercourse with each other's wives, mothers, sisters, or daughters, not to strike a fellow Master Mason, and to help fellow Masons when they are in distress. This is no doubt what Freemasons claim to be the personal development and moral training that they provide to their members. It is somewhat disturbing they are not specifically bound to follow these rules in relation to the rest of humanity, only in relation to their brothers. Here you can see some of the penalties that go with breaking these oaths. The penalty that a Master Mason agrees to if he should break his oath is no less penalty than that of having my body severed in two, my bowels taken from thence and burned to ashes. The oaths vary according to the specific degree. So for an entered apprentice, the oath is merely no less penalty than to have my throat cut across from ear to ear, my tongue torn out by the roots, and my body buried in the rough sands of the sea, a cable tow's length from the shore. And then for fellow craft degrees, it's no less penalty than to have my left breast torn open, my heart and vitals taken from thence and thrown over my shoulder, over my left shoulder. So all this reminds me of pirate talk. It's something out of Robert Louis Stevenson's novels. And sure enough, Robert Louis Stevenson was a Freemason, and the skull and crossbones were in fact a well-known Masonic symbol, as well as being now adopted, of course, by the famous fraternity at Yale University, which is again an offshoot of Freemasonry. But while we might scoff at all of these oaths, rituals and symbols and secret handshakes as schoolboy nonsense, carried out now, it seems, by largely geriatrics, but we should bear in mind the knowledge that men really can be very bloodthirsty and capable of these kinds of unspeakable acts. And it was interesting in the material I was reading, there were several books talking about Jack the Ripper being a Freemason. It seems there's significant evidence that the mutilations of his victims were inspired by these Masonic oaths. So all the victims had their throats cut. One was severed in two. Another had their bowels burnt to ashes, which seems pretty specific to me. Another had their heart ripped out with their vitals thrown over their shoulder. A compass was engraved on one victim's face, and Masonic graffiti was left at the scene. It seems to me that there clearly was a bit of a cover-up, that this wasn't all quite obvious and made more obvious at the time. But anyhow, I've obviously digressed from the main topic. So we all know that there's crazy cults that have existed that engage in mind control and sexually motivated violence. But I hear you ask, what could this possibly have to do with the trans movement? But seriously, for me, the eye-opening information was just how many cults, religious or otherwise, borrow from Masonic traditions and can trace their origins to a founder who belonged to the Freemasons. So I could spend a lot of time on that, but I'm not even going to get started other than just to note how often they like to refer to themselves as the family and how often there are reports of sexual abuse of children. So I think people are probably familiar with this pattern of cults run by sexual predators that demand unquestioning loyalty and conformity and the use of psychological manipulation to achieve this. And I'd let people draw their own conclusions about all of that. So back to specifically the origins of the trans movement. So Karl Baer was a German-Israeli author and social worker who is claimed to be the first individual to undergo a female-to-male sex change operation in 1906. While not technically a Freemason, Karl Baer was director of the Berlin Lodge of B'nai B'rith, which is a Jewish fraternity modelled on Freemasonry. It was established at a time when Jewish people were experiencing difficulty being accepted into Freemasonry due to anti-Semitism. It continues to operate today, and its members have included many significant individuals, including Sigmund Freud, various Prime Ministers of Israel, as well as some non-Jewish people, including President Harry Truman, who was also a Freemason, and worked with Winston Churchill, also a Freemason, to establish Israel after World War II. I was interested to read that Einstein, who was offered the presidency of Israel, was also a Freemason. Anyhow, again, I'm being distracted. Karl Baer provided a first-person account of being raised as a girl in his book, Memoirs of a Man's Maiden Years, written under the pseudonym N.O. Body. This book was very popular when published in 1907, was twice made into a film in 1912 and again in 1919. He was hailed as the first trans person to successfully have changed his sex on a birth certificate and to be granted the right to marry. Except that none of this is true because he wasn't trans and it wasn't a sex change operation at all. This is because he was raised, although he was raised as if he were a girl, in fact, he was always a boy, just a boy born with a disorder of sexual development, hypospadias. So he shared his experiences of being raised female while he was feeling as if he were a male with German physician and sexologist Magnus Hirschfeld, who collaborated with him in publishing his book. And Hirschfeld then went on to write further books on the subject and continued to operate a practice in Berlin through the 1920s, which was like a hub for trans people. He was arguably the first advocate for transgender rights. However, under Hitler, his Sexology Research Institute was looted, his books were burned, and he was forced into exile. Now, before that happened, he happened to be very lifelong friends with Harry Benjamin, who used to visit his Sexology Research Institute on a regular basis and then went on to experiment on men's genitals back in New York. Benjamin then published what became the first textbook on transgender medicine in 1966. And in 1979, he founded the Harry Benjamin International Gender Dysphoria Association, which is the precursor to the present-day WPATH. He also hosted its first conference and set up the first standards of care that same year. So 1979 was a big year. I noticed in the introduction that apparently that's when Janet Raymond wrote her book, The Transsexual Empire, as well. It was also the first Australian conference on transsexualism and it was the year that the Australian and New Zealand Committee on Transsexualism was founded. However, in Australia, the real progressive hub was at that time in South Australia, where we had a very progressive premier in Don Dunstan. And in 1975, he decriminalised homosexuality. And then in 1976, there was sensational press coverage of the first known gender affirmation surgery in that state. And in 1978, a gender clinic was established at Flinders University. So everything was all going very well on the front of trans rights. in that state in particular. But in 1979, there was also a succession of brutal serial murders began of young men and who were abducted off Adelaide streets, sexually tortured, and at least 5 young men were brutally murdered. And this was believed to be committed by a shadowy network of pedophiles known as the family. So this group seemed to be highly connected, and yet somehow, after all these years, only one perpetrator, an accountant called Bevan Van Einem, was ever committed. Meanwhile, a number of names of high-ranking members of the legal profession and business world in Adelaide, as well as some health professionals, all those names that were involved in the trial have been suppressed. And the interesting thing about these crimes was that the modus operandi for the crimes involved the cooperation of several members of the trans community who acted as female decoys and helped lure the boys into the car. Strangely, none of these individuals has ever been held accountable for their actions, and it's always been understood that they were facilitating crimes which were apparently committed largely by elite members of Adelaide society. That's always been the suggestion, and of course, this is there are no convictions beyond that one of Van Einem. Several members of the trans or drag queen community shared a house together where the boys were taken, and 3 of those whose names have been made public, but they're already deceased. They all died quite early. One of them is still alive and living in Sydney. I don't want to dwell on that, but I just want to say that it's probably a good idea to be wary of men in strange aprons. There was another individual called Dr. Peter Leslie Millhouse, who was charged with one of the murders, but was acquitted on the basis that his surgical skills were not adequate to have dissected the body with the precision used. So he was acquitted on that basis rather than anything else. So I won't go into detail, but it's worth noting that there were indications that the bodies, including their genitals, had been surgically experimented upon by someone with training, medical training, high level. So there's much more details about all of this in this book by investigative journalist Debbie Marshall for people who are interested in that. But where's the connection to Freemasonry? Adelaide was a Masonic stronghold and was known as the City of Churches, but clearly became the City of Corpses, and that there were certain key people in that state who were involved in passing some laws. For instance, this Robin Millhouse passed the first bill, or no, didn't pass it. He tried to pass a bill to decriminalise prostitution, which was unsuccessful. So there were a lot of things going down. Elite private schools were involved, and I just suggest if people are very interested in pursuing this, that they have a look at this movie based on a story by Frank Morehouse, which seems to be autobiographical, at least in part. And it talks about boys who were groomed to do favours to...
We're now going to go to our second speaker, who is Lauren Levey. Lauren Levey is a board member of WDI USA and also serves as the coordinator of its Lesbian Caucus and coordinator of the State Legislative Advocacy Team. Lauren also serves as coordinator of Lesbian Bill of Rights International, Aylesbury, and thank you so much, Lauren, for speaking. The title of Lauren's talk is Choose Lesbian. So over to you.
So I've been noticing that TERFs seem to be winning. One sign is that the media blackout on issues involving gender identity has mostly lifted, even in the US and even in legacy media. I've noticed it especially since the most recent US national election and since the UK Supreme Court's ruling that sex is real under the Equality Act. By the way, I'm especially proud of the lesbian interveners for their crucially persuasive arguments in that case. I'm not surprised that lesbians played a leading role, and I'm so proud of my UK lesbian sisters. Meanwhile, the US Supreme Court is expected to rule in US versus Skermeti, which is essentially about medically medically disguising the sex of minors, but it's also unavoidably about gender identity in general. The decision is expected sometime in June. WDI USA submitted a wonderful amicus brief in that case, and we're actually feeling kind of hopeful. You can read our brief on our website. So it looks to me as though women, including lesbians, are about to get some of our spaces back on both sides of the Atlantic. If that's true, lesbians might consider what we want to do in those spaces that serves our collective lesbian interests. The members of the WDI USA Lesbian Caucus have been engaging in wide-ranging discussions about why patriarchy on both left and right continues to outdo itself in obsessively trying to erase, denigrate, and vilify not just feminists, but lesbians in particular. Our discussions have been fantastic, and along with writings and talks by Sheila Jeffries and others, those lesbian caucus discussions have informed what I'm planning to say here today. But to be clear, I'm speaking today strictly as myself and not for the lesbian caucus. So now, after a long and distracting hiatus made necessary by the trans campaign, radical feminists, including lesbians, may soon be able to get back to our main task of pulling down the pillars of patriarchy, and radical feminist lesbians in particular can perhaps now get back to the uniquely lesbian task of modeling what free women might look like and what love relationships might be like when they're based on equality, liberty, respect, and dignity. Now I'm going to focus on what's known as political lesbianism. The term itself has acquired the properties of a powerful taboo whose mere utterance stirs up so much anger, scorn, division, and sheer panic among all demographics that there's a temptation not only to avoid talking about it, but especially to avoid using the term political lesbianism. So I've just said political lesbianism 3 times, and now I'm going to finish opening that box and attempt to shine some light on its contents. And I invite you all to come along. Apparently, and maybe in reality, for patriarchy to endure, it must not be seen as possible for women to escape heterosexuality. Meanwhile, heterosexuality is unavoidably unequal because it is structurally impossible to equalize the role of heterosexual wife-mother within a patriarchal system. Increasingly, I see women understanding this. I see women regretting their straightness on social media all the time. It goes something like this. A woman will tell a horrendous personal story about how she had a terrifying date with a man or a disgusting date with a man. She says she feels lucky to have escaped safely. And then she'll follow up her story with a familiar script of utter helplessness. If only I weren't heterosexual, if only I could have been born a lesbian. The next 3 slides are a variety of screenshots of comments on recent Instagram posts, and the names of the posters have been blacked out. I think in my hardwiring, I am more straight than gay. But because of the experiences I have had, I am becoming less and less into men and more into women. A lot of men repulse me, very few women do. Someone else says my attraction to men fades more and more each day. So the first woman here makes 2 contradictory statements. First, she refers to hardwiring, meaning she thinks she's innately straight. But then she observes that she is becoming less into men and more into women. So she's becoming more lesbian. And she thinks the change is due to her experiences rather than to her nature. I'm going to guess that the bit about hardwiring was something she felt obliged or even pressured to say. And the rest is actually honest exploration that makes her quite vulnerable. Rage and doing what I can to turn myself gay. I hate being straight. For real, if anyone has any tips, I'm all ears. I was straight for like 22 years. YouTube helped me a lot. You know, I think we may want to make more YouTube instructional videos on how to become a lesbian. I grew up exclusively attracted to men, but have had tremendous amounts of trauma because of them, and I've found myself gravitating to dating exclusively within the NB/trans community. I cannot look at a male body and be attracted anymore, and I'm not sure if it's because I'm finally allowed to explore my sexuality or if it's because of the trauma or both. I think it's both, to be honest. As someone who went from bi to lesbian, a lot of my sexual preference is due to feeling so deep-seatedly unsafe with men that I am incapable of feeling romance or sexual chemistry. Even men I love, they are brothers to me. So there are two more women who are fairly clear that their sexuality has changed. There does seem to be some confusion here about whether hating men means you're a lesbian. Clearly it doesn't, since these nominally bi and straight women sound as though they hate men way more than most lesbians do, which makes sense since straight women have much more intimate involvement with men than lesbians do, and therefore, I would say more hatred-inducing experiences. But let's be clear that being lesbian means exclusively loving women. It doesn't require any particular feelings about men. So why don't more of these straight women take the obvious step and become lesbians? I see two reasons. First, we're in a socially regressive era at the moment, so it's hard to choose what's now being framed once again as sick, evil, deviant, and simultaneously innate. And second, many lesbians are currently suspicious and unwelcoming of newbies. My friend Lorraine Nolan, who created WDI USA's Black Women's Caucus, recently wrote on her Substack, "It blows my mind that women are the only class that is compelled to form relationships with their primary oppressor. That has to change. I cannot tell you how many women I've spoken to on and off the internet who have lost their attraction to men. Some who still desire men wish they weren't attracted to them. There are even women who claim they chose to be lesbians." She continues, "Any household that is successful and fatherless by design is a threat to patriarchy. That includes lesbian households. This is why 4B is a valuable option for women. Not dating, sleeping with, marrying, or having children with men needs to be normalized." Well said, Lorraine. So I'd like to look more closely at all of those Instagram comments and at some of their assumptions. The first assumption is that women are helpless victims of their own sexual desires, that their fate is sealed by their own sexual desires. Their only choice, it seems, is between a scary man and a disgusting man. A related assumption is that sexual orientation is innate and not socially constructed. Lesbians are said to be born that way, and there's no way either to opt in or to opt out. Both of these assumptions are based on the familiar theme of femininity, that women lack agency over their own lives, including sexual agency. Women don't choose, they get chosen, says the patriarchy, both inside and outside of our heads. But in fact, there is no scientific evidence that sexual orientation has a biological basis. In fact, there are plenty of women whose sexual orientation has changed for one reason or another, and everybody knows it. For several years during the 1990s, I facilitated lesbian coming out groups. Women would come to the group for different reasons. The first reason was because she had been bisexual, but had come to the realization that she simply wasn't attracted to men's bodies anymore. Possibly because she had discovered that men are frequently terrifying and or disgusting, or possibly for no reason that she was conscious of. Second, because she had always been straight, but suddenly fell in love or became infatuated with a woman, and now simply knew that she was done with men forever. And third, because she had always been straight and was still occasionally attracted to a man's body, but because of life experience, she no longer wanted to have sex with men. She didn't want that dynamic in her life anymore. Could she become attracted to women? Could she stop being attracted to any man? Could she make herself into a lesbian? Today, under the dogma of born that way, the first two women might be accepted as lesbians, but only on condition that they rely on patriarchy's compulsory heterosexuality, or compet, to explain the apparent change in their sexual orientation. In other words, the script goes, they had always been lesbians, born that way and all. But compet had hidden their innate lesbianism from them until the moment when they were no longer able to ignore it. Conveniently, this explanation is consistent with women's presumed lack of agency. It's consistent with the gender of femininity. They couldn't help themselves. As the third woman, today she would be excluded as a lesbian by those who believe in Born That Way. She will be instructed by the Born That Ways that she has no agency in the matter, and that there's no shame in being a bisexual woman who chooses to have only female partners, because bisexual is what she innately is now and forever. Conversations with exactly this content are on social media every day. So women learn that if they hope to be accepted as a lesbian by lesbians, they need to get this script just right. The problem with the Born That Way argument, besides its political dysfunction, is that scientists have mapped the whole human genome and have failed to definitively identify a biological basis for lesbianism, or for that matter, for butchness or feminist. There's a historical basis for Born That Way, but there's no known biological basis. The history that I'm aware of is that early in the 1970s, one of the early gay rights organizations in New York, I don't remember which, run predominantly by gay men, decided that the best chance for homosexuality to get legal protection would be to present it to the courts and to the public as being exactly like race. Race is something you're born with and it never changes. And Black people had just recently, in the 1950s and 60s, had spectacular success arguing exactly those points. So the gay male lawyers decided that sexual orientation needed to be like race in order to argue convincingly for equal rights, meaning to those gay men, decriminalization, the right to marry, and the right to be custodial parents. In other words, the right to be fully enfranchised patriarchs. The radical feminist lesbians in New York at that time were not at all aligned with the goal of becoming fully enfranchised patriarchs. These next slides date from the second wave. The text of the first slide was written by Rita Mae Brown. I became a lesbian because of women, because women are beautiful, strong, and compassionate. I became a lesbian. I love this one. Feminism encourages women to leave their husbands, kill their children, practice witchcraft, destroy capitalism, and become lesbians. Okay, that was uttered by Pat Robertson, a male Christian fundamentalist who was no friend of women's liberation from patriarchy. But he was pretty sure that women could become lesbians and that doing so was connected with feminism. Let's take that slide down, please. As women who understood patriarchy and who understood that lesbian sexuality was simultaneously erased and punished, radical feminist lesbians at that time didn't want the superficial reforms that gay men wanted. Those lesbians wanted decriminalization, of course, but they didn't even see same-sex marriage as desirable. What they wanted was the destruction and reordering of every institution, and they understood that they needed political power to achieve that. But the gay men's agenda prevailed over time, until now. So now, let's ask some radical feminist questions regarding the Born That Way doctrine. Whose interests are served by having women think it's impossible to become a lesbian, or by having women think they're stuck being straight, like it or not? I'm not seeing how it's women's interests or lesbians' interests that are served. And why is being attracted to other women framed as impossible for some women? For the record, women are very easy to love if you're paying attention to them. Born That Way dogma has inevitably escalated into a purity spiral. I'm seeing current narratives that the best lesbians, or maybe the only genuine lesbians, claim a biological basis for both their lesbianism and their butchness. And they're also gold star lesbians who have never been with a man. So much for ideals of equality and eliminating oppressive class hierarchies. Born that way marketing, enhanced with this lesbian purity spiral, traps lesbians into becoming a vanishingly tiny, politically powerless, sexual minority whose strictly defensive political agenda begins and ends with, "Would you please stop beating me, sir?" We can do so much better. Going back to my 1990s lesbian coming out group for a minute, some women from each of the three categories did become lesbians, meaning that they remained in the lesbian community for as long as I knew them and apparently functioned in every way as lesbians. And some women in these categories who participated in the coming out groups did not make the change. I don't know why. We didn't do any follow-up studies and we weren't sociologists, but it seems to me that this much is probably true, that some women successfully chose to become lesbians, and that probably our coming out group helped them to do that. That some women did not become lesbians probably meant that they didn't choose to. My next question is specifically about the potential power of political lesbianism. What do you think might happen to patriarchy if every woman understood that there was a stable, well-functioning community of beautiful, skillful, ethical, woman-centered lesbians, ready to accept new lesbians into that community? To put it another way, what if it were generally true and generally known that life as a lesbian is freer, longer, healthier, more egalitarian, sexier, and way more fun than straight family life typically is for women? We wouldn't even have to abduct men's wives and daughters as men might fear. I suspect that lots of women might come to us quite willingly and happily. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Miriam Kivlehan from Ireland. She's a long-time activist in feminist and women's spaces and is going to give us an update on what's going on in Ireland.
Okay, so that's me, and I've just titled it Development, Debates and Dissent, sort of an activity update as to what's been happening in Ireland really for the last 2 years or so. Okay, so I thought maybe I would look first of all at kind of the legal and policy context, the drier stuff. So again, in terms of the Gender Recognition Act 2015, which is very often attributed to having been a precedent, even in terms of internationally and certainly in the English law, I suppose, domain, the Gender Recognition Act in Ireland was quite influential beyond the scope of the Irish jurisdiction and became borrowed. There has been no formal review of the gender self-ID model since that, so that still exists. It's still based on self-identification. It applies from 18 years or 16 or 17-year-olds can self-ID with court order. Then in terms, the HSE then, after the Tavistock closed down, the HSE, which is the equivalent of your NHS system here, the HSE did have a referral pathway to the Tavistock. Since the Tavistock has closed down, there has been no pathway post that. So again, there has been a lot of inaction in many ways with regard to what's happening in Ireland in terms of those medical and what's called the trans healthcare. So there's still no alternative pathway created. There's a lot of lack of transparency with regard to the HSE. And I suppose that links in some ways to the CAS review. So how did Ireland respond to the CAS review? There was a lot of media silence on it initially, and a lot of political silence. I suppose they're the two main things. I mean, whilst the review had emphasised the lack of evidence for puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones in youth, and it recommended the holistic, cautious approach. There was sort of radio silence here for quite a while. I suppose people were hoping that there wouldn't be a response. Now, obviously, I suppose because there are the two jurisdictions, the north of Ireland and the south, and the north of Ireland is still very much linked, we'll say, to the British legal system. Very often there can be a conflict between what's happening in the north and what's happening in the south. So you don't necessarily have harmony across both jurisdictions. Having said that, there was eventually then some limited response to the CAS review. I think as an evidential document, it was very hard to ignore. So a lot of the activists were calling upon the likes of the HSE and calling on politicians to respond to it. So there was a little bit of media coverage, but I say not a lot. The HSE, tentatively, it appeared like that they might review their policy in light of CAS, but as yet, there is no indication of a policy review. And I suppose it was subject to the same, it did allow, I suppose, a talking point again for a lot of the activist organizations and groups to come back into the domain, because they usually don't have access to that kind of mainstream dialogue, be it political or media. So I suppose at least it was a fulcrum upon which some of the activist groups and the women's groups could try and raise the issue back into the public domain again. Political parties were equally inactive, I would say cowardly in many ways, because I think it's generally considered that a lot of the political parties probably don't have a consensus view with regard to this issue, and that they are aware of a lot of dissent within their own ranks. So therefore they just avoid the issue. They don't necessarily even address it openly within the political parties. So again, it's just, and last year, I suppose, when we had so many elections, we had local elections, European elections, and national elections, all of the political parties would have been avoiding anything to do with this subject around about that time. So just still within that whole political and legal context, then we had more recently the UK Equality Act ruling. And just with regard to that in terms of Ireland, so again, there was interest here. There was quite a lot of interest in the ruling. And again, it's amazing the difference sometimes 6 months can have in terms of the willingness sometimes of even media to discuss it. But I think in many ways the reason why people found it easier to discuss that ruling was because there really isn't a comparative situation in Ireland. So and very often our pieces of legislation between Ireland and Britain are usually very, very well mirrored. But in the case of our equality legislation, we don't have a distinction at all between sex and gender. And gender is the default language exclusively that has been used in our legislation. So it's not really clear that there is an opportunity within our legislation to take the same type of challenge. It's more likely that what would be needed is a reform of our equality legislation, which is, of course, again, a much more difficult process, because you will have the resistance. So would be looking to amend that legislation, and there's no political will to go there. In the outgoing government, the last Minister O'Gorman, he did initiate a review of all the equality legislation, and that would have been about 2 years ago. So that would have been across the Equal Status Act and employment legislation. And I know there were huge amounts of responses and public submissions to that. I'd say far greater than he would have anticipated. So the result of that was, again, the review was shelved, and there was no action taken on it because a lot of the dissent emerged. And then last year we had all of these were intersecting, of course, in that whole space of the legal space. So we had hate crime and hate speech bills, which intersected with these issues. So we had initially a piece of legislation that was moving forward with criminalizing hate as a crime, but also criminalizing speech as a hate crime. So there were two different things. There was aggravated sentencing for all sorts of for all sorts of assault crimes, that there could be aggravated sentencing if it was motivated by hate. That gave rise to a lot of discourse. And then separate from that, there was a proposal to criminalize hate speech. What happened with that piece of legislation was they went forward with, even though it hasn't still been enacted yet, but they went forward with the hate crime part of it, but they dropped the hate speech part of it. Because again, there were a lot of women's groups actually and women's activists that were very concerned about the hate speech, because again, in terms of the chilling effect that it has had on silencing discourse, and how easy it is then just to label people transphobic, and the potential of criminalizing discussions and public debate. So they were kind of the main overarching things in terms of the policy space. So then maybe just having a look at what has been happening, because I know some of these groups have contributed to your spaces before. So just looking at both the gender critical and radical feminist activism. So a number of groups had emerged over the last number of years. There was the Countess, the Women's Space Ireland, Radicaline, and then various alternative media have emerged. I know some have contributed to this space in the past. They have remained active. Now, I will say that in many ways there have been maybe some wedges have emerged in the last year or two over other issues. So there's not as much cohesion, and maybe there isn't even as much camaraderie between the different activist groups as there would have been in the past. Ireland is a very, very small population nationally, and even having different groups of itself, kind of reduces the impact or the scale. That said, most of the groups have taken particular roles, but they very much came together around about key campaigns. But in the last year, that hasn't been the case. We had a contentious referendum last year, around, well, two referendums, referenda, whichever, let the Latin scholars correct me on which is right or wrong. So one was a family amendment, and the other was a Kerr amendment, the shorthand. But one was to change the classification of, it was actually to remove the word mother out of the Irish constitution. And that became a very, very interesting feminist debate in Ireland, because the assumption was before this that if you were progressive and feminist, you wouldn't want mothers protected in the constitution. And that therefore removing it was a progressive idea, and that resistance to it would have been a conservative idea. But through a lot of debate and dialogue, it became quite apparent that there were a lot of progressive arguments for maintaining protections of mothers in the constitution. So that fell. Now, unfortunately, the other one as well, which is the family amendment, which would have had a lot of benefits to women, also fell, because essentially what happened was there was really just one campaign. All of the political parties got behind the Yes, Yes campaign, and as also did the opposition parties. So in essence, you really didn't have an enlivened debate, and a lot of people would have voted against those amendments just out of a resistance to the fact that there wasn't really open discussion on both sides of it. So I mentioned that more in terms of the background, because there were other things happening that then began to drive, I suppose, a certain amount of wedges and wider space between the different groups. And that has certainly atomized and fragmented a lot of the action in many ways. Now, having said that, there was also opportunities even in terms of the election. So you would have had the likes of Leisha, who was involved in the Countess. She went forward for election. She stood, she sought election to the upper house, the Seanad. So again, finding women who did go and decide to run for election, it gave them a certain platform to discuss those issues, even where they were unsuccessful. But those are still the most, and then we've had a lot of the alternative media, and I know that was mentioned earlier. So there are a lot of other spaces now emerging, be it through podcasts and Substacks, and you've had the likes of Stella O'Malley and the Jen Specht and her podcasts. So there's, whilst there aren't hostilities, I will say that it's not that there are hostilities within the groups, there just isn't the same amount of cohesion because of various other things that might have driven space there. On the other side of it then, in terms of the LGBTQ plus lobbying, you've had, I suppose, the strengthening in many ways of the likes of TENI, the Transgender Equality Network Ireland, and Belong To, which is more the youth faction of that. Well, it's broader than that. Belong To is quite LGBTQ as well. They're very well positioned. They certainly have very close links with state departments. They continue to be extremely well funded. They have a lot of influence on policy, both at, as NGOs, both in terms of literature and in terms of political policy, and they're quite strong lobby groups. So in terms of education, they have certainly fairly successfully inserted themselves into schools and into new curriculum development. So again, there was quite a lot of discourse last year around a subject that is in the schools called SPHE, Social, Personal and Health Education. And there were new curriculum materials being developed around that. And a lot of them, once those materials were coming into the public domain, there was a lot of discourse around what was very obviously gender ideology, and also some very problematic attitudes towards things like race and ethnicity. One could argue that some of them were nearly sort of like the Robin DiAngelo critical race theory ideas being applied. So that again became a whole other discussion. But again, I think what it did was it made a lot of people aware of the proximity that these lobby groups have to the formation of things like educational materials that find their way into the schools and into onto the curriculum. So yeah, that's so public flashpoints, I suppose we've had this, like in most places, sports, prisons and shelters. So in terms of the Indigenous sports in Ireland, you have the Gaelic Athletic Association. That's a male sport. They look after exclusively the Irish men's football, Gaelic football and hurling. And then you have the LGFA, which is the Ladies Gaelic Football Association, an entirely separate self-governed organisation. And they formed their version of the game back in the 70s. And then you've rugby and swimming. Now, the LGFA, there was certainly a lot of talk last year because there was a certain amount of policy capture and there were decisions. So this would be an all-female organisation, and therefore at its national council level and its higher executives would be female. They did take a decision to allow trans women to participate in LGFA events. So that certainly was a flashpoint. There were a lot of rank and file LGFA members, women who were playing in the game, who did stick their head above the parapet. And so there was a feeling that there was policy decisions being made by at senior executive level that didn't actually have the support and mandate of the players at club level and provincial level. So rugby, conversely then, the women's rugby has adopted the international position on it. So they are very clear that they don't recognise the transgender self-identification in terms of participation in women's rugby. And we've had, again, flashpoints around the prisons, the male-born individuals in female wings. That's still it's largely goes largely unreported. We had a few high-profile cases like the Barbie Kardashian that would occasionally make its way into maybe tabloid newspapers, but the lesser-known cases not so much. So again, there are sort of small groups of women who act as watchdogs around that particular space, and they bring that to the fore where they can. And then a little bit as well around about the domestic violence shelters and rape crisis centres. I think they are particularly silent in many ways with regard to it. They don't want to take any kind of public positions on it. Most of the rape crisis and domestic violence shelters are all very small, locally based services. They're all non-profits. They're independently constituted. They're significantly reliant on both public funding and on donations. And I suppose very often they just kind of keep a division between getting engaged in the public debate and trying to protect the work that they're doing with women. So that hasn't become a particularly nationally discussed issue. Well, certainly not from within the stakeholders. Media discourse, I suppose, if you're to look at it, it falls into the two categories. You have the mainstream media and you have the independent and alternative medias. So, I mean, just to sort of be very generalized about it, the mainstream media still very much takes this affirmation-led approach to the whole discussion. And on the other hand, then you have to look to alternative media, podcasts, and as I said, the blogs and Substacks to find independent voices that are challenged. That the only exception to the likes of the mainstream media is there's one conservative, quite right-wing media that is now an accredited mainstream media, I suppose, if you like, body, gripped media. So again, and again, it's a lot of male voices that actually are speaking within those media forums. So what you often have is in the mainstream media, those that are speaking about the trans issue, and they're never speaking about trans men, they're only talking about trans women, are men. So men are very often dominating the conversation in the mainstream media, and it's not women, it's not women led. So yeah, so that's sort of where we are with media. This is just, so then to continue on that theme then, how very often men can actually take up quite a lot of the space. So there's been, some of you may have come across this Enoch Burke saga, I shall call it. So it's one individual who has, you know, there's a lot of sensationalized media around this particular case. It gets a lot of spotlight. There's no substance usually to it. It's one guy who was fired from his job as a teacher because he refused to endorse the pronouns. Now, he was working in a well, most of the schools in Ireland follow one or other of the main church ethoses, either Roman Catholic or Protestant. This was in a Protestant school, but the school had adopted a policy that the students could choose their own pronouns. He refused to endorse that. He was sanctioned, he was suspended from his job, and he basically took up a strike action outside of the school. They still haven't gone through a disciplinary process, so he's still on the payroll. This is about 2 years on, but because he was in occupation outside the school gates, they took him to court to have him charged with trespass, and he was charged with trespass, and he just kept breaching it. So he's ended up going to prison on quite a few occasions on trespass and contempt of court because he wouldn't purge his contempt. But to the outside world, that has become that he's going to jail because of his views on transgenderism. So it has conflated and taken up a lot of the space. And it's absolutely, you know, sometimes it's framed as a gender row, but it's actually just as a contempt of court and employment issues. They're an extremely evangelical family, and they've been involved in lots of issues over the years. So his particular position is rooted in religious ideology, and because it's unrepresentative of any kind of feminist critique, it has forced a lot of the groups and the women are women to constantly disavow themselves from the Enoch Burke saga. So it was worthy of putting it up there because, as I say, it gets implicated in so many things. So just in terms of, I suppose, maybe trying to kind of round it off and see where we are now, Ireland has been slow to adapt, as I suppose, despite the more external global shift, and that we have seen, and that we would be aware of in the English-speaking world. The legal and the medical ambiguity still persists. Women's voices are rising, but the activism is extremely fragmented. As I say, so many other issues that have come to the fore that have driven political wedges between women. And sometimes it's not even just around stuff like that necessarily just impacts women, but I suppose there is a bit of a left-right divide as well, and even within some of those circles. So sometimes it can be the geopolitics in Ireland. It can be something like support of the Palestinian cause and not support of the Palestinian cause. It has literally split women who would have been had a certain amount of cohesion around about the transgender stuff. So and then there have been a lot of pipelines have emerged in terms of all of the other tensions with regard to immigration, has created so many pipelines that people have now moved towards, and women as well have moved into those. So it's really hard to see where women are moving towards, but there's been quite a lot have moved to the right in terms of conservatism, but some have gone to the far right and down some of these kind of neo-nationalist, into these neo-nationalist warrens as well. And meanwhile, I suppose we have so much political cowardice that definitely political courage is certainly needed in terms of moving forward.